User. Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to all of the new webinar attendees and friends from previous ones too. So tonight we're joined by Paul Moseley, a former forester, a countryside ranger, a woodland manager, an ecologist. Paul's whole career, though, has been leading up to this point and the dizzying heights of being a two-time SWOG webinar host. So Paul gives a lot back to the woodland community. In the short time I've known him, already he's done 2 webinars and many community efforts. So tonight you might know him from the Success in Succession webinar from September of last year. But I'll hand over straight over to you, Paul, because tonight's your night with the Survey and Impact Assessment webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so if anyone hasn't seen that previous webinar yet, I would highly recommend going back and looking at it, because essentially what I try and get people to see is a way of taking very, very complex, sometimes nuanced ways of trying to understand woodland into something that's digestible. So in the previous webinar, we looked at how you can take all of the different ways of thinking about woodlands and how they're changing or staying the same, and basically take it down to 5 different options. So it helps with the management process. This one is going to be more about how do we start to build up an evidence base for you to be able to then base your management for the woodland on. So at the end of this, I'm going to tell you how to get to my website. I've now made a little public drive, which if you click on it, you can open it, and you'll be able to go in and get a copy of these slides and also a copy of the template that I'm going to be going through. So you'll be able to get everything down. Okay, so survey and impact assessment. So we're going to look at things which build on one another. So firstly, we have a phase 1 survey. So there are lots of different ways of doing surveys, but very broadly, you can put them into one of 2 phases. And phase 1 is where you have some descriptions and you have lists of things. Okay, just to separate that from a phase 2, which is where you start taking transect lines and quadrants and working at percentages, and it becomes quite statistical, which obviously from an ecology level you need to do at times. But in terms of just building the basis for a really good approach for looking after your woodlands, it's a little bit too far down the technical route for us at the moment. We're then going to look at impact assessment, so understanding what's going to have an impact on the woods, how we might have an impact on it, where others can come in and also have an impact, and how we can avoid or mitigate those things. And then finally looking at taking those 2 different bits of information and putting it into a woodland management plan, where we start to look forward and think about over the next few years, what might we need to be doing or doing less of in order to maintain the health of the woodland. So we're going to literally go through those steps. We're going to look at the templates, which you'll be able to download and use to understand this process. But I think a fair question, which I have been asked before quite a number of times, is, well, why go for the effort? There is an assumption, if you like, that if you leave a woodland alone, it will always become more beautiful and more healthy. But that's not always the case. Now, if you were to go back certainly Industrial Revolution, Agricultural Revolution, you get to where you have these sprawling woodlands and forests that have all the different stages of succession happening at once. You know, at the north end, it might be establishing woodland. At the southern end, it's turning back into sort of scrubland. You know, and you've got all these kind of subtle changes and developments in the relationship between different kinds of woodland happening all at once. Since humans have come along and essentially cut that up into a patchwork, there are now smaller pieces of woodland which will struggle to have all of the different successions going on at once, which is a really healthy woodland. And so we need to step in and artificially sort of create those. We need to look after them now, just as, you know, humans hunted the wolf to extinction. We now need to be the predators for deer. It's exactly the same with woodland. So by going through this process, we can actually then start to mindfully think about what is the biodiversity of that woodland, what's the habitat that's there or could be there, and how important is that we protect that? How important is that within the woodland? How important is that within the local bioregion? So if you were to think about, in the Midlands, and if you were to think about certain bird species, you might be in a really fantastic opportunity to be able to put something in place to look after a particular bird species or butterfly species, which is locally, maybe nationally, and maybe even internationally struggling in terms of population. Now, there's obviously the economic benefits as well. So, you are in a fortunate position to own or have access to a small woodland. The quality of that woodland is going to be an important consideration when you think about what the value of that woodland is. So some species, for example, oak, they tend to draw higher economic value than if we were to find a piece of woodland that was predominantly birch. Now, that's not to say that you should always try and just create an oak woodland. I mean, that really does take centuries of planning and effort anyway. But we can start to think about, if we've got some birch woodland, what is it that's unique to birch woodland, pioneer woodland, that we can make the most of? And that ultimately is going to have an economic benefit. We can also think about the sustainability of that site as well. So we can think about, if we're going to be harvesting things from it. So, for example, it might be that you take some firewood, you maybe take some for crafting. How could we do that in a way where ultimately the woodland is not damaged, but we still get to do the things that we really like to do? And most times, not all the time, but most times, that just comes down to good mindful management. Very rarely is it a case where situations conspire where we just can't do what we would like to. It's always about a balance. It's about almost having a conversation with the woodland and trying to figure out what each of you is trying to do and how to kind of accommodate one another. In terms of sustainability as well, we've obviously got the change in the environment that's happening. We've got biodiversity that's at an all-time low, but we've also got climate change happening, so that temperatures are starting to creep up, and that does have an impact on woodland. It has an impact on things like their timings, has an impact on their ability to draw resources, to draw nutrients. So we need to think with average temperatures starting to change. Firstly, how's that going to affect our woodland? And then secondly, is there anything we can actually do about that? And lastly, there's obviously just the joy of having a well-managed woodland. Being able to get in there, enjoying the views, being able to go in there and understand that it's actually a safe space to be. I know many people who, when they've started along the journey of getting involved and spending time in woodlands, for them, the lack of understanding of how woodlands work is their biggest concern. They don't know what is dangerous or how something might be dangerous. Whereas once someone's got some experiences, they can start to look at the health of trees, they can understand how woodland works as an entire body and how that will respond to wind and storms, etc. So there's also the enjoyment of being able to nurture a woodland to be a healthier space for itself, but also for us to use as well. So phase one survey. So very, very simply, what a phase one survey is saying, right, where is the woodland? What do we already know about the site? What is on the site? What different habitats exist? Because even though we're looking at woodland, there's different types, broadleaf and conifer, there's wet woodland, pioneer woodland, ancient woodland. There could be other habitats intermingled with that. There might be some heathland, for example, or streams. Starting to build that very, very basic bit of information is the first step of a phase one. So this is the first page of the phase one template that I've put together. Now, some of this is incredibly obvious, but as we go through, I want to talk about some of the opportunities that are there. I've spent a huge number of years teaching forest school practitioners how to go through this process, whether it's a woodland that their school owns or they own, or whether it's another woodland that they've got to approach the landowner. They have to demonstrate a certain sense of responsibility and ability to understand what's going on. But when you have those little bits of woodland that perhaps have never had a name, it's a fantastic opportunity to give it one. If you're thinking about taking your children, grandchildren in there, or letting local school groups in. It's much nicer to say something like, we're going to go down to Squirrel Nook Wood than we're just going to go down to those trees over there. So you can be poetic with this. You could look into local history, you can look into local land features, maybe call it off, what the old estate used to be called that it's no longer a part of. So yeah, have fun with that and see what name you could give it if it hasn't got one already that actually might be its name for the next few centuries. These things get passed down. It's really good to make sure you're very clear about where that is. So location, grid reference, and I'm going to come back to watershed. So location could be a postcode, could be a description. You might say, for example, to the south of T Lane. But a grid reference obviously gives an absolute unmistakable point in the landscape. And you don't necessarily need to understand how grid references work or how to create one. This could be, for example, a really useful bit of information to have if there's an accident. So again, I was talked to for school practitioners about this is important for a number of reasons. One, you get an absolute categorical sense of what part of the landscape are you talking about here, but also if need be, you can obviously phone for emergency services, give them a grid reference number, and they're going to know literally exactly where you are. So rather than to describe, which gate you turn left at, etc., you can provide them with that. So you can go onto websites like Ordnance Survey. You zoom in, I think it's the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the grid reference number. It'll be 2 letters and then a series of numbers. And by watershed, watershed is what river does that land ultimately drain into? So, for example, where I am, I'm at the headwaters of the River Trent. So I'm in Staffordshire. So I'm along some of the first water bodies that come together that make the River Trent before it goes all the way off 188 miles, I think it is, up to the Humber. Okay, so I'm in the Trent watershed. And other than being a really fascinating thing to look into and understand what a watershed is, there's also a very practical reason. If you think about the health of woodlands, if you think about what pollutions, what pesticides, as another example, could be going into the groundwater and where it drains, if you have a sense of where you are in a watershed, you can understand what's upstream, literally, what's downstream, and understand where you fit into part of that ecology. Approximate site is fairly obvious. Whether you like to put it in hectares, acres, it's completely up to you. But again, it says approximate. So obviously, if you've bought woodland, you've probably got maps and someone's measured it before. It's also worth double checking the measurement if you ever do get the opportunity. If you're getting someone in to do a survey, or you can go online and you can check on a map, because sometimes there's actually quite a bit of difference. So soil type, pH. So soil type and pH matters in terms of understanding what trees would grow there. And if you're planting, probably helpful to plant those kinds of trees. And if trees are struggling, because maybe your woodland was planted up, why it's struggling. So there's a couple of different websites you can go to. You can go to one called iGeology. Now, iGeology presents you with a beautiful map that you can zoom in. You can also put a postcode in. And if you zoom in, it'll tell you exactly what the geology of your area is. So, for example, it will tell you if you're on chalk, it'll tell you if you're on mudstone, it'll tell you if you're on sandstone, for example. And it was already starting to give you a sense of what is the drainage like, what's the chemical composition like, is it acidic, is it alkaline? But you can also go to, let me just, apologies, clicked on the wrong thing. You can also go to this one here. This is Land IS. Okay, so this one, you can find out about the soil composition. All right, so those 2 websites there. When you download these slides, you'll be able to click on these and it'll take you to the website. As I mentioned earlier on, woodland type. So is it deciduous, ancient, coniferous? Is it a woodland plantation? So rather than it be a naturally self-set, self-regenerating woodland, Is it a woodland that's actually been planted? Was it planted to create a sort of natural woodland? Or was it created to be a timber woodland? And maybe that's not the case anymore. All of these things have a bearing. What additional habits are there? Grassland, scrub, ponds. And do you know anything about the history of the site? Now, it could be that there isn't really much of a recorded history. When you took over that woodland, maybe you got some information, maybe it was a conversation. It's worth starting to write these things down, otherwise they do get lost in time. But it might not necessarily be, a long drawn out romantic kind of history that, Henry V once had a picnic there or something of that nature. It could simply be that, your family's owned it for 50 years and you know who the previous family was. And during that time there was a pond, but ultimately it was filled in. Little things like that over time start to build up and provide a useful collection of information. Any other features? So for example, could there be footpaths? Could there be power lines that you're aware of as well, either running underneath or over the top? And are there any designations, or are there any protections on the site? Is it a local nature reserve, site of special scientific interest? Are there any TPOs? And then finally, if you've had any sort of tree surveys or you've had anyone doing work, it's good to have a place to record those kinds of things. Just so, again, you never know when someone in the future might come into the woodland, and understanding what has happened previously, either from a very physical health and safety point of view. Was that tree inspected because it's now at a point where it's going to start dropping limbs? Or could they actually look back through, understand what previous management has taken place? So for example, there's a 30% fell of all the sycamore. Well, straight away, before seeing a lot of sycamore, but realizing there's a few, they know that the propensity of sycamore sending out lots of shade through all of the seed starting to grow, and it become a very, very thick layer very, very quickly. So just little notes like that can be very, very useful for the future. So the second part of our phase one why is my screen not working? There we go. Is to look at now in a little bit more detail, okay, what is there on the site? How could we describe the different features of it? And is there any other characteristic that's really important? So this is where we get more into the survey side of things. And as I said at the start, it's about lists and descriptions, really. So this is an example of the level that you would be looking at. So we could look at a piece of woodland and say, all right, it's a well-established woodland. And we would know that because there are some really large mature trees there with a varied age structure. So what this means is that rather than it all be the same age structure, they're all the sort of same size, same age. You've got big mature ones, you've got small young ones. Of mainly native broadleaf species, the southern portion of the site is a small wet woodland. Okay, so just in those two sentences, there's already quite a lot of information, but that's all it needs to be, okay, at this stage. If you wanted to do a really in-depth survey, then you could start to look at phase twos. But for the vast majority of woodlands that I've been involved with, managing for a number of years, we find that actually this is enough in most circumstances. If we're going to manage a particular species, then we would look to a phase two. But in terms of general woodland management, phase one is enough. So once I've described it from what I can see, and this might be the whole site, or you might break it down into a section, a compartment of the site, then I'm going to start listing the species that I'm seeing there. And very, very simply, what you tend to do is you tend to put the one of which there's most at the very top, and the one of which there's least, or just one of them, down at the very bottom. And the way that this works is, for example, you sent me this and you wanted me to come along and have a look at your woodland. If I saw that you'd put oak there, and I look around and I think, there's probably more oak than anything here, then that's it. It's literally illustrative rather than descriptive, so to speak. Okay, we're trying to give some ballpark ideas without necessarily describing the woodland in absolute detail. Okay, so at this level, we don't need to know that there's 43.5 oak. We just need to know that the woodland is predominantly oak. And second to that, there's quite a bit of birch. And then in the wetter woodland, it transitions through alder. Right at the very wettest part, you've got a bunch of willow. And then there's 2 or 3 lonely pines somewhere. Okay. Now, what you can do with this is use a form very simply like this. You can see it's not very technical. It's just titled boxes. And in that, you can then just start to write your descriptions. You can put a list together. And obviously, there's only so much you'll be able to identify. Trees are fairly accessible. Plants are, again, fairly accessible, but obviously seasonally. So this already starts to plant the idea of we might need to do this more than once in a year. What I always recommend is you do it 2 or 3 times in the first year so that you can start to account for the seasonal changes. Okay, so obviously trees are going to be there, if not in leaf, all the year through. Plants will come and go. So it could be, for example, today I saw some of the wonderful snowdrops that are coming up. They're only there for a relatively short time, so you could actually start to have a little sort of shorthand. So you can put a plant species like snowdrops and then brackets SP for spring. And so you're starting to again put in a very simple way lots and lots of information as you start to go through and build up what the seasonal changes are. Fungi, they're a lot of fun. Certainly there's a bunch of them which are really accessible. However, eventually you get to the point where they all kind of look similar. The joke I inherited from the forester that trained me is eventually they all just look like LBJs, little brown jobbies. Who knows what they are? Who has the time, frankly, to microscope to look it up? But what I find is there are people out there that are incredibly passionate about it. Same with birds as well. Sometimes that as try as you might, it's sometimes very hard to get a good sighting of a bird to be able to identify it. And especially when we get into things like invertebrates, etc. And mammals can be so fleeting, you might find the tracks and signs, but again, you might struggle to really understand what's going on. Is to find people who are passionate about this. So local wildlife trusts, I find one of the best resources for people, obviously, who have a passion for a particular thing. And it could be that you have an open day or you invite 1 or 2 of them along. For them, I found the interest is always getting access to a piece of wood they never have before and maybe finding something new and interesting. Anyway, they're engaging with their passion, with their love. But I always find if you take a thermos of tea and a Victoria sponge cake with you, that always cheers them up anyway. And what I would also say as well is that because this is something they're passionate about and very knowledgeable about, they might go through things too quick for you to digest. So my sort of approach to this always is I'm always enthusiastic. I nod and say yes to everything after the first 2 or 3, because it's only the first 2 or 3 I'm actually probably going to remember. They can whittle off 16 or 17 type of fungi that I've never seen before. I'm going to struggle to remember all of those. So what you can ask them to do is, as they go around, is just to write down what it is that they're seeing. And obviously you can take photographs alongside that as well. You can put them together and go into an ID book and start to get to know them better after that point. But that time with them is incredibly valuable. So you need to make sure you can capture it in a way that it's there for you afterwards. And it's not a case of, you heard it once, if you forgot it, then oh well. And down the bottom here as well, there's a few different things. So endangered plants and invasive species, there's links there to to find out what they are. So if you do come across them, just to be aware that they are endangered or they are invasive. And again, if you talk to people at the local council, if you talk to tree officers, for example, talk to the wildlife ecologists, they'll be able to tell what local responses at the moment. Okay, so if it's endangered, they might want to come and start doing regular surveys on your site to keep track of it. If it's invasive, there might be some funding that they can get someone to come in and deal with it. There's all sorts of different things. Okay, so this is the main chunk, if you like, of your phase one surveys. Here, I've spoken very generally about a whole site. It could be you have one of these for individual sections. Okay, so it could be that you start to look at having maps for the site, and you can start to identify different sections. So you could call it section 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, E. You could call them different things at all. You know, this is the blackbird woodland, this is the robin heathland. So whatever makes it manageable. So you could hand draw a map, or another option is you can get a Google map, okay, and you could just start to note certain things about that site or that area of the site. Okay, so in one area, this is actually woodland very close to where I live. There's a certain section of the woodland where the deer like to lay up very, very regularly. So there's obviously something about that spot they really like. And if I go in and dramatically change that, unless there's huge ecological value, I'm perhaps doing more harm than good. Other areas are really open, and there's a wide variety of butterfly species there. So again, if I went and planted trees there, okay, yes, we've got more tree cover. That can be, you know, a valuable biodiverse habitat, but diverse in the term biodiverse means many different things. So for that reason, we want to perhaps make sure that they stay as grassland. The conifer, it's just conifer and bramble. So that's maybe low biodiversity value. So I go in, I survey that. There's, you know, two species of conifers. There's very little seen in there in terms of birds and bugs and things and fungi. And that could start to create some conversations around what could we do with that area perhaps. Interestingly, on that site, that was actually a bunch of Christmas trees that was randomly planted 30 odd years ago that no one's ever done anything with, and really sticks out like a sore thumb. So it could be a hand draw map, could be a Google map like this, and there's no rule about how you sort of demarcate it up. You can see the squiggles I've put on there, some of them follow contours of tree lines, some of them don't. Okay, so don't worry about being overly technical or overly detailed about these kind of things. Get something down that starts to record the thinking behind what you're going to be doing or what you think you might be doing, because then that is not only shareable, but you can update it as well. Okay, so ecological impact. So far with phase one, we've built some information, put it together, and we've got a picture now of the woodland as a whole, or maybe we've got sections of the woodland that we've got different assessments for. So now it's starting to think about the other side, and what is it that's going to be happening in there? What are we going to be doing with that woodland? And very simply, what we're trying to do is just understand how sensitive are the habitats in there. If we were to start to take firewood, if we were to start taking school groups in, if we were to start having campfires, etc., if we started to fell some of it for timber, ultimately, what's that going to do to the woodland? So a woodland is an ecology, it's a system. If you start taking out chunks of the system then changes. And sometimes it degrades down to a poorer ecological system. Sometimes when we do other actions, it increases its biodiversity. So this isn't always necessarily just good or just bad. For example, with heathland, lowland heathland, we're always trying to have it where it's a low energy system. There's little nutrients on site. And there's other times where a certain kind of woodland, we're making sure that the last thing we do is take nutrients out. For example, if you've got an ancient woodland, the last thing we want to be doing is taking out nutrients from that cycle. So once we kind of understand the site, we can then begin to reflect. Okay, so the things we are doing or we might want to do, what's the impact going to be on flora and fauna? Could I be doing something that actually might affect something like the water levels? If I was to go in and start taking out a lot of to take the previous example, alder and wood, they're not going to be taking up as much of the water, so the water level perhaps going to rise. how's that going to affect more of the birch, more of the oak that's on the edge? And then finally, okay, so I'm going to think about what is it I need to reduce or mitigate in some way for the things that I'm having an impact on. So this is the template. I've put extra information in here, so you don't always have to include all this. But this is now starting to think about what is it that's going to be happening on the site, and might it have an impact? Now, it could be that your woodland is somewhere you go for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, but not a lot else happens. Okay, so that's great. What you can just look at, as in the case of the example here, is obviously along the footpath, there's going to be some compaction. There's going to be some trampling on things that might have set seed and started to grow up. Now, that's not to say that's bad and you shouldn't. How dare you be in the woodland doing those kind of things? Uh, it's always about putting it in context. Yes, there's going to be trampling along the main pathways that you have running through there. If that means the rest of it is left fairly undisturbed, then that's great. That's fine. That's a nice balance point between you and the woodland. If you open it up, be an activity centre of sorts, where schools are coming in, they've got 30 kids a day running around, lighting campfires, climbing trees. You're then going to obviously start to have a proportionate impact on the site. So it's about recognizing that and making some decisions about what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and how you might need to respond to the impacts that are being seen on the site. So I've put an example here in for a forest school, which is obviously very, very popular. So think about what's the people pressure, the noise, the disturbance, and the trampling that's happening. So it's obviously very, very different if you have one group coming in, might not be forest school, just be a school group, for example. If you've got one group coming in, or scouts, once a week for 2 hours, that's very, very different from 17 groups coming in, all for 2 hours each throughout the week, every week. So the type of impact, but also the proportion, the amount of that impact is really important to consider. And it's not just necessarily the physical impact, so to speak. If you think, well, we put in there, there's noise. How the noise impact on, for example, the deer that come through? Is it going to disturb their habitual trails? What about bird nesting season? Is suddenly now having people in there around the time of nesting going to disrupt that? Thinking about if you're having fires, again, how is that going to impact on the ground? If you're removing dead wood, either to have fires on the site or removing it to your woodshed to burn in your home, what kind of impact is that going to have? Now, dead wood is an incredibly important part of the woodland. A lot of time people think that, and I think understandably so, that if it's dead, it's no longer of any use. Well, this is going back to the nutrient cycle. If you take wood out of the woodland, there are nutrients that will be burnt rather than return to the soil. And over a long enough period, that will start to have an impact on the nutrients. Bearing in mind there's nutrients constantly coming in and out of that little ecosystem. Again, it depends on the context, the extent. How big is your woodland? How much deadwood is there? How much are you taking? But equally, it's a very, very important habitat. Okay, the bugs that live off it, the birds that live off the bugs, and so on and so forth. It's quite important. It's very important in terms of biodiversity. Are you cutting any live wood to make things, to do carving? What are you doing in terms of organic materials? So are you leaving things where they are predominantly to die down? Do you feel like a woodland should be quite neat and you're removing things from the site? I actually have been to a woodland and used a woodland before now. The two lovely people that used it, the wife took me to one side one day and said, while you're here, could you work on him? And what she was asking me to do was to say that it's okay to leave fallen branches just where they are. It's not messy, It's natural, it's organic. We got there eventually. Eventually, he relaxed. But it could be that someone feels like they need to be removing things from the site because it doesn't look as nice. And again, thinking about, what is it that's happening when you're, turning over logs? What about the materials you're bringing to the site? Are there going to be things that are just left? Will they degrade? Litter as well. So to take this example, then we can identify the impact. So trampling, and we'll say that this is, a moderate. It's a 2-acre woodland, and there's sort of 3 paths that crisscross it that we go in on a Sunday, maybe a few other times a week to just enjoy the space. Okay, so yes, we're having an impact on the ground layer and the field layer on the margins. We're trampling, we're compacting the ground a little bit. Okay, but we're only doing that every so often throughout the week. Okay, and it's to only certain parts of the site as well. Okay, so how will this information inform your sustainability management plan? Sorry, sustainable management plan. Well, a fair question here sometimes is, well, does it need to? Is there anything of any sort of level of detriment here that we need to start to think about this longer term? Now, it could be that you're changing the habitat. Okay, so we're going to jump to the other end of the spectrum here. So identify the impact. So woodland management. It could be that we are changing from a birch woodland to a predominantly oak woodland, okay, over time. So what's the nature of the impact? Well, it's going to be everything really, from ground layer right up to the canopy. What can you do to minimize and avoid the impact? Well, obviously, woodland management tends to take place in the winter. So that's better in terms of tree planting, that's better in terms of tree felling. So let's say we're felling some of those birch to make space for oaks that we've grown from local acorns from the site, and we're going to be planting those out. So all of those things happening in the winter is already a benefit because we're not going to be disturbing, for example, nesting birds. We're not going to be impacting much on the activity of invertebrates that are going to be on the trees and the birds that are going to be trying to eat the bugs, the invertebrates that are on the trees themselves. So we're dealing with it at the quietest time of year. Then we can start to think about, okay, well, how will this information inform our sustainable management plan? We can start to think about, rather than doing a huge chunk in one year, maybe we break it down over a series of 5 or 6 years so that we're doing little sections as we go. And although the impact is still going to be fairly large, we're doing it. Okay. So what's really key about this is it's not saying that you should never have any impact whatsoever. What it's saying is, let's just think about what those impacts are going to be. Are they intentional? Are they accidental? Are they ultimately going to be of benefit to the woodland, despite being an impact in the short term? Or is this something actually we could start to change the way we think about things? So it could be maybe some of you have started thinking about deadwood since I mentioned it, how much you take from the woodland, you're taking out from that ecosystem, the nutrients. It could be that you start to just think a little bit more mindfully about it. Okay. So we're into the final step now. So this is where we bring all of those things together, the site management plan. So what is it that we've understood about the woodland? What is it about we've understood what might happen within that woodland, what we're doing, what we let others do, and what's that going to do in terms of the medium to long-term health of the woodland? So this is where we pull together a summary. We start to think about putting some planning in place, and we're recording that process as well. Because again, it could be that you're going to be asking other people to do it, or other people are going to inherit the woodland, and it's good to have a record of what you were trying to achieve so that they can, carry that on. But a really important word here is the word planning. Okay, this is just a plan. Plans change. So just because you've written it down doesn't mean that you're forever stuck to that decision. Okay. And there's also the option of the planning could be that you're going to observe. So it might be that you've got a particular area that's woodland and you're wondering about are the water levels rising? Is there something that's happened upstream? You notice that woodland getting wetter and wetter. It could be that you rush in there and you start digging things out and creating drainage channels, etc., etc. But it could be also that you decide, I'm going to observe this for the next few years, and I'm going to notice to see, does it settle? Does it perhaps return to its previous levels? If you're increasing each year, just because you said for 5 years I'm going to observe it, if after year 3 you realize, okay, I really do need to do something here, then you do that. Just because it's down on the plan doesn't mean it's forevermore. So these are living documents, all of these things. They're just simply templates to help you work through your thinking. It isn't something that you're kind of legally binding yourself to forevermore. Okay, so here's a quick example that's been put together. So site management plan, what is it you're trying to achieve? What's your rationale? And what is it that you're going to do? How are you going to go about that? Okay, so let's say we've got an oak woodland with some birch, there's some alder and willow in there. And our plan is to slightly reduce the birch, to slightly increase the water levels if we can, so that we get more willow. And we're doing that because willow and oak have very, very high biodiversity values, very high numbers of invertebrate that live off them. Okay, whereas birch, not so much. And also with birch, you can cut it back, and because the seed is so much seed comes off of birch, it's always going to be growing there. So it's not something that you need to be particularly worried about losing out on. There'll always be birch there. They'll self-set really, really quickly. Okay, so let's say that's our rationale. So we're trying to increase the biodiversity of the site. We could even go into the history of the site and realize that actually more of this was oak, but they felled a whole bunch of it for firewood, and birch established itself. So we're going to reduce the birch slightly, maybe get a few more oak in there, maybe then also extend the willow if the water levels can be brought up a little bit. Okay, and then it's about just breaking that down into a series of steps, really. So what's the task? So selective small tree felling, okay, taking out the birch. Where is it going to be done? You could here say refer to map, and there's a highlighted area on the map. Who's going to do it? So it could be volunteers, could be yourself. You could be getting a contractor coming in, depending on the nature of the actual the job itself. When will it happen? So again, you can decide over the next year, or over the next 5 years, or over the next 10 years, we're going to slowly impact on the numbers of those birch. Why are you doing it? So again, just linking back to that bigger idea, we're going to remove some of the birch so that we can plant up some oak that we've brought on from seed, and also give space for the willow to establish itself more. And then what's the impact going to be? So ultimately, we're going to have higher biodiversity on the site because we're going to have a more dominant species, be those of a higher invertebrate value. Willows are about 453, I think. Last time I looked, anyway, different kinds of species of invertebrate that will live off it. Oak is 400, somewhere around there, I think. So you're moving on quite a high level, really, of invertebrate species compared to birch, which I think is 136. So looking at the impact that's going to have, it's going to increase the invertebrates that live on site, and then obviously all of the biodiversity that that brings with it. And what you can then start to do is start to plan that out in a series of steps. Okay. So what's the management focus? And again, you could do this by section as well as by year. So let's say, this is the birch section. So sustainable in year 1, we're going to have management focus of enhancing biodiversity. So the action is going to be to fell 5%. Okay, 5% of all of the silver birch that are there. Who will do this and when? I'm going to get my mate Dave, who is a contractor, tree feller. He's going to come in during the winter of this year to do that. Okay, so how will they do it? Simply tree felling. anticipated impact on here it says forest school site. Overall, is it going to be positive or negative? So you can put something a little bit more descriptive in here to say an initial loss of species, but to be replaced in future years. Ongoing maintenance required. So is there anything that you need to be following up with? And how will the progress be monitored? So how are you going to know if that's being effective or not? And one of the simplest things to do nowadays is just to take photographs. So you can look at the work that's being done, take a photograph as it's happening, and go back 6 months later, take another photograph. And you can start to compare and contrast very, very easily rather than trying to rely on memory, etc. So this is the approach I always use. Could be on a site that you're using regularly that you don't notice the change because it's quite subtle day to day. But if you look at a photograph of, I do a lot of stuff with nettles, for example. I'm always teaching kids how to make string from it and things. So it could be that 6 months later, I'm looking at a photograph of what it was like 6 months ago. I didn't think we're taking that much, but actually the pictures can't tell a lie. We've taken more than I thought. So it's a case of, right, okay, we need to rein back on that a little bit. So like I say, this is year 1, there's a year 2, there's a year 3, for example. You can take it right up to year 10. You could also change the sort of intervals. You could say this is year 1 to 5. And then you could have another sheet, this is 6 to 10. But again, going back to that idea at the beginning of this is planning, this isn't sort of written in stone. You could realize that actually that's not as urgent, so we'll put that back a few years, or this is now urgent, let's bring this ahead. You might discover things and ways that your woodland responds as you're doing this work. So, for example, you might clear some of those birch, and suddenly there's a new plant species that's coming up. And now you want to start to think about, well, this plant species, what is it? Is it rare? Is it endangered? What's the biodiversity value of it? You know, what's going to be living off this? What's it going to do to the area? And maybe actually now that becomes a third part. We're clearing out some of the birch so that we've got some oak, we've got some willow, and we've got this new plant species. And you can break it down area by area as well, depending on sort of the size of your site, I suppose, to a certain extent, but also just the makeup of it. You might have two very distinct sections within a woodland, or even different habitats. Okay, so that brings me to the end of going through this process with you. If you go to my website, you've got the website details at the bottom there. If you scroll to the very bottom of my website, in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a few little links. And in there, you'll find, in fact, actually, maybe just show you, you'll find a link which is Public Drive. Okay, so that very, very bottom here, Public Drive. And in there, there's just this at the moment. Okay, you can get all of the slides from this evening, and that's a copy of the template you'll be able to use to create your own.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Paul. That's ever so handy. And I tell you, we can link that in our SWOG newsletter as well to yeah, sort of to signpost people. Thank you so much, Paul. We do have quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to use the time wisely and I'm going to get stuck in. So some people are recommending that, you know, for the location of your woodland, what 3 words is good. I think a lot of us have used that. Thank you for that recommendation.
Yeah, that's become more popular, actually. I've started seeing that more and more places, yeah.
Yeah. And then somebody says, how do you go about changing the name of a woodland rather than stay with the name that the agent gave? Do you know how to do that?
Well, it depends where it's recorded. Some names have no legal entity whatsoever, but you can go through the land registry. If you contact the land registry, you can actually change the name through them. There's a small charge. I think it was £15 the last time I had to do it, which was probably 10 years ago. So I'm not sure what the system is now and how much it costs. But yeah, the land registry are who you need to contact.
Okay, just out of curiosity, what did you change yours from and to?
It actually had a number. It was a compartment of a larger woodland. and this was compartment 13F or something ridiculous like that.
Oh, okay.
And I named it after my daughter.
Oh, that's lovely. That's nice. So, in our woodland, we're in Nottinghamshire, and all of them are named after sort of Robin Hood-esque things. So we've got Merriman Wood and things like that, and we're Maid Wood, which I'm quite pleased with because
And that's
like
okay.
Maid Marian, that's quite nice. Um, so, um, so land registry. So someone has asked, do you have to have any qualifications to carry out a phase one survey?
No, no, not at all. If you're doing it on your own woodland, then no, there's absolutely nothing required. If you're going to help a friend out, again, nothing required. The point of change really is if you're being asked to do it professionally.
Okay,
And there's professional indemnity insurance and all those kind of lovely things. So if you're doing it informally, then no, because you know everything I know now about phase one surveys. That's what they are. Lists
okay,
and descriptions. If you can identify an oak and I can identify an oak and I can say I put that at the top and you put that at the top, you're as qualified and experienced as I am to do it.
okay. That's good to know. Thank you. And then somebody has asked, there are increasingly apps that can help with ID. And so the person here, Julia, says that she uses iNaturalist, and that site helps a lot.
Yes.
Also, anyone with an iPhone, if you take a photo, that's quite good for, the identifying species as well. And then somebody's saying that Pippa has told us that her wood is called Tidy Wood, which she finds an ironic name. I should be called Bramblewood. um, so then somebody has recommended something called My Forest is a very good online resource to use.
Yes, actually, yeah. That is a very good one, actually.
And I've just loaded it so people can see me because I'm talking. That's what the website looks like. So My Forest, all one.
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
surprised I didn't think about mentioning that, actually. I was using it this week to create some shape files. Yeah, Mind Forest is all free, and you can go on. It can be a little bit busy once you start putting in lots of layers and compartments and things, but if you're not putting too much in, it's really a fantastic site to use. Because then you can that Google map essentially that I did, you can have all of that on My Forest.
Okay, so Gordon asked that question. So would you say that's the best one that you would personally use to geolocate things?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, good. So Ian Hannah asked, the access track to my woodland is on a route of disused railway, and either side there are wetland habitats with good populations of invertebrates. I would like to lay additional surfacing on the track. Are there any materials that you would recommend, as I want to avoid leaching into the wetland and causing damage? Would a standard type 1 aggregate be safe? Off the
It's
top of your head.
yeah, it's difficult to say. There's a few. Um, I can give people my email address, and I can send you a few links to some of the aggregates that I use.
Okay.
Um, which might, yeah, that'll probably be the best way to go rather than me trying to think off the top of my head.
Yeah. I put you
Uh,
on the spot there. Sorry, Paul.
that's all right.
Okay, yeah. If you at the end, if you type in your
I'll type it in now.
email address, yeah, do that, and then we can get that
Yeah,
sorted.
the sort of alkalinity of different aggregates can have a huge impact. Sometimes literally just the particulate form. Um, some of them can break down. It's one of those things where they get to a sort of point of no return. So once each individual block breaks down, once it gets to a certain size, it breaks down even easier. And so you do get lots of dust coming off, and that can line pools, and that can start to actually allows it makes it more difficult for it to oxidize.
Right. Okay. Um, Ed is musing that presumably we're also thinking about impacts from deer, squirrels, dogs, invasive parakeets. I should have read it before I read it out loud, as well as human activities.
Yeah, so principally this is about how do you caretake of the woodland, but if there's something or someone that's coming in and having an impact, I actually saw the parakeets for the first time only 4 or 5 years ago down in London. It was a very odd experience. you can start to think about, okay, so what do we need to think about here? So if, for example, I know in Norfolk at the minute, their numbers are astronomical and woodlands are really getting hit bad. Like I mentioned towards the beginning, I think, the walls no longer exist, so we actually need to manage the woodland. I just did my deer stalking certificate recently. So it could be that you need to look at how do you do some fencing, or what are the deer numbers like? Are they so extreme that actually there needs to be a conversation about culling deer? If you've got grey squirrels as well, and they're causing a lot of damage to trees, that's an invasive species. I know we've sort of adopted them now begrudgingly, but do we actually need to do some squirrel management as well?
That's another webinar for another day. Yes. Yeah, so Kerry says thank you for the links. Just passing on the thanks. How much should you or can you do in ancient woodland?
It will very much depend on uh, the woodland itself. So if it's an ancient or semi-ancient woodland, it will already be known to people. It will have been mapped to the nth degree. It will have phase two surveys, and there'll be probably lots of caveats as to what you cannot do. Assume you can't do it, and be pleasantly surprised if there's anything you can do.
Okay,
But wildlife trusts, I can't praise wildlife trusts enough in terms of they are so fantastic at knitting together communities of people with these interests, much more than, in my experience, county councils are. So if you talk to wildlife trusts, they will be able to give you guidance and put you in touch with anyone legally that you need to.
certainly. I think I've only ever found any of the wildlife trusts to be the nation's sweetheart, so I'm a big fan of them. Sarah asks, I have a question of the surveys. Where do they go? And are there other organizations that need the data?
So these are principally for you as the owner and or kind of manager of it. Um, they don't need to go anywhere. They don't get registered with anyone. But if you apply for funding, if you want to apply for a felling license to fell some of the trees in there, for example, then these are the kind of documents that they'll be asking you to, if not necessarily send to them, base your applications on. So the more knowledgeable you are about your woodland, the more you have that recorded, the more you understand what's being impacted on, the more you have a clear idea about what is it you're trying to accomplish with the woodland, assuming it's not just make lots of walking sticks, for example, then it could be that they can use that information for you to get felling licenses and grant funds and all sorts of things.
Okie dokie. Another question here. Are the
I was
utility...
joking about the walking sticks, by the way. You can actually.
Yeah, there's good money in that. Um, are the utility providers of overhead and telephone cables affable to help?
They are affable. I've got to be careful what I say here. They are affable. Again, depending on well, not even the company, the utility company, it's even by region, I have found personally. Some will just, because legally they have a responsibility. Legally, they kind of have unbridled access. If you're underneath, if you've got a power line going through, they can just come and crack on if they need to, essentially. Um, some of them do it with a great deal of sort of respect and reverence for sites. We've had it just in the last couple of years whereby they've come in, and I don't know how to describe it. They it literally looks like they've just got something with huge chainsaws whizzing around on ropes and just walk through this woodland underneath the power cables. Um, to say they left a mess is a polite understatement. Um, so yeah, it really depends. I think, as I've sort of intimated a couple of times, it all comes down to people and relationships with people. Getting to know the local wildlife trust, getting to know people in the county council, for example. Um, getting on board with local people that know what's going on with the deer and the squirrels and all these kind of things. Those connections are so important. And I'd say the same with utilities companies. If you can kind of strike up a relationship with whichever utility company has something come through your land, and if you can get to know the people that actually come out and do it, then that's a good start. But yeah, varied, I think, is the summary word for that. Varied.
You'll have to email me later in the week. I want to know who the goodies and baddies are. See
I
if
can
you
tell
can
you for
relate to
my
their
end,
customer
yeah.
service. Um, so I think we're gonna speak Ed's question. Interested to hear thoughts on nutrient management, retaking products out, e.g. some woodland may be historic coppice and the flora and fauna depend on that cycle and the removal of some degree of timber.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's not about not having an impact. It's just about understanding that impact, making sure that you are sort of judiciously understanding what that impact is going to mean. Like, for example, I talked about heathland. You know, to actually remove everything is good. You want it to be nutrient poor because you want it to stay as heathland. You know, lowland heathland is one of the most protected, important sites. And so a coppice sits, further up the scale than that, where it's about this cycle of nutrients. But if you're doing coppicing, there's only so much else you can do. The withdrawal that you make in terms of nutrients, with coppicing is such that if you've got a rotation coppice going, you can obviously mediate that over a number of years. It's a continuous, subtle process rather than clear felling an entire site. But there's only so much else you can do on top of that. You can't be doing coppicing and removing oak for firewood and removing this for walking sticks. There's only so much you can do.
Okay. Well, there are quite a few. This has been very popular, Paul. There are a few more questions. I think I will collate them via email to you, and then everyone else also has you've popped your email address in the chat. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. If they want to email me, then I can make something up that sounds convincing.
Okay, that sounds really good. Um, Thank you so much, Paul. I think short of coming to each of our woodlands and doing the survey yourself, I think you can't have done more for us tonight, really. And I think the links to the paperwork is just a really nice touch. Thank you so much. I think we all have
Sure.
I think we've all learned plenty tonight, but any questions, please email Paul and his website's there. And we will link to that in the SWOG webinar, in the SWOG newsletter also. So,
Well, one thing as well, just very, very briefly, I am putting a bunch of online courses together, and some are going to be about woodland management and things. And if anyone's interested, if you're part of SWOG, you're going to get a huge discount.
oh, great. Well, like we've done before, Paul, if you want to email me and we can get that in the SWOG newsletter with words to that effect, that would be great. And we're happy to share anything on our socials for you. So thank you. And I'm not trying to force Paul here, but this is a part 2 of a trilogy. So the third part is to come. So at a date that we are yet to decide, isn't that right? So
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, we'll figure that out.
I
In
wanted to
fact, if
get it
people
on.
want to let you know what they'll be interested in.
Yeah, well, please email us and let us know what you might like the third part of the trilogy to be. It might be a Douglas Adams, it might be a 4-part trilogy, who knows? Right, listen, everybody, it's tea time, so go and get your dinner. But thank you so much, Paul. And I'll speak to you soon. I'll speak to you in the week, and I'll send you the link for the YouTube video as well. All right. Thanks for your continued support to everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.